Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to see you again. I'm Farah Wardani. I'm a curator and art historian from Indonesia and your host, as well as moderator for this program session. We collect, connecting culture, art, science through UK Indonesian museum collections. So a bit about the program again. We Collect is a series of research seminars and creative lab programs that will create dialogues and connect expertise between a range of heritage practitioners and researchers from the UK and Indonesia, as well as a network of researchers, curators, and artists from both countries. It is made possible by British Council Grant Connection to Culture 2023, and I would like to again give special thanks to Director General of Culture of Indonesia, Museum and Cagar Budaya, and Indonesian.tv, as well as most especially Science Museum Group London. This is our research seminar series number 2. We are having with us here our speakers from Science Museum Group, Charlotte Connolly, Rupert Cole, and Alice Naylor. Thank you all for making time for this session. This is also to follow up from the keynote last Monday by Dr. Tim Boon, Head of Research and Public History of Science Museum Group. Thus now we are given privilege of the actual work done by the curators and researchers from the museum themselves. As a curator with my background, especially like in the context of Indonesia, I must say that scientific objects or instruments as heritage collections and exhibition materials is quite a new field for me. While Indonesia itself has rich resources of heritage science, as we might have learned from last week's research seminar 1. And I think some of the discussion participants here are also excited to learn more from these distinguished speakers. Charlotte, Rupert, and Alice will share about their contemporary approaches in research and curatorial strategies on history of science and historical objects based on their individual scholarly work and also their projects at SMG. Okay, without further ado, I will start with our first speaker, Dr. Charlotte Connolly, Head Curator of National Science and Media Museum, Bradford. Before I hand over to Charlotte, if you allow me to introduce Charlotte to everyone. So following her undergraduate degree in history and philosophy of science at UCL, Charlotte Connolly began her curatorial training by undertaking BT Connected Earth Research Internship at the Science Museum in 2009 before completing postgraduate degree in museum studies at University of Leicester. In 2010, she returned to Science Museum, where she was part of the curatorial team behind the Information Age Gallery. From 2014, she was based at the University of Cambridge, initially as a PhD student in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, and from 2015, also as the museum curator at the Polar Museum, part of the Scott Polar Research Institute. From 2019 to 2022, she was chair of the University of Cambridge Museum Steering Group, which oversees the joint work of the university's 8 museum and botanic gardens. In late 2022, Charlotte returned to the SMG as the head curator at the National Science and Media Museum. The museum is preparing 2 new galleries which will showcase sound and vision technology, and which are due to open in 2025 to coincide with the Bradford's time as the UK City of Culture. So please, Charlotte, we look forward to hear from you.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction. Let me just share my screen so you can all see what I can see. So hopefully that's working all right for you.
Yes, great.
So as you can see, I'm branded up as the University of Cambridge. I'm going to be sharing some of my work that I did before I joined SMG. And I'm going to be talking to you about this instrument in particular, and the work of Georg Simon Ohm. So Ohm was a natural philosopher working around 200 years ago, and he came up with what we now know as Ohm's law, which is a very famous law in electrical science and one of the fundamental laws. And I took a material-led approach to investigating how he came up with his law, which was a bit of a challenge because, as you can see, I've showed a picture of his instrument here. The actual apparatus doesn't still survive. We've got the picture and we've got quite a long description from him. But so this is about how do you do a material-led investigation if the thing you're trying to study doesn't still exist. Before I get into Ohm himself, I wanted to reflect on where things are at with history of science as a discipline. So I've picked out 3 quotes here, and I've picked them partly because they're 10 years apart from each other. So you can see there's been quite a long period of time where we've been considering these ideas. So Otto Siebem in 1995, around 30 years ago, wrote that historical studies predominantly use textual representations of the past, notebooks, letters, and papers. He had a vested interest because he was doing research which involved reworking and reproducing historic experiments. 10 years later, Jim Bennett wrote, perhaps historians are a bit too bookish to work with objects and are not always at ease with this type of work. Now, Jim Bennett, again, had a vested interest. He's a very illustrious historian of science and has worked in museums for his career. And then 10 years later again, we've got Anne Gerritsen and Giorgio Riello, they're anthropologists, and they wrote that they thought it was quite a new thing to study scientific instruments as things. And they were responding to a moment in anthropology, which was called the material turn, and biographies of objects were kind of all the rage as part of that turn. Now, I've included this not because I agree with it, but because I think it's interesting that that was how they perceived history of science as a discipline just a few years ago now, that they were able to say it's quite new to study scientific instruments as things. So there's a general perception that in history of science, we're not using objects as much as we might. And there's some statistical evidence to back that up. So Sam Alberti, again, somebody with a vested interest. He was, had a long museum career and is now, I think, head of collections at National Museum Scotland. He published a paper, and this statistic was in one of the footnotes, and it said that for one of the leading Anglophone history of science journals, ISIS, only 5 out of 136 authors had evidenced close study of objects over all of the papers published in the previous decade. That's something like 4%. And when you consider that evidence of close study might be as much as looking at it and citing an object in the same way that you might look at and cite a text-based paper, that's not a very high bar when you think a paper might have dozens, if not hundreds, of text-based citations. So you can make a claim that historians of science haven't been effectively using material sources to the same extent that they might do. I'm not saying that every paper, every time anyone does any history of science ought to be object focused, but it's really quite a small proportion of them that are. And as organisations that care for objects and really think about why we're caring for them and argue that we've got a research motivation for doing that, that's maybe something to think about. So going back to my research then, looking at Ohm's work, I did a literature review when I first started out, but I also did a material culture review. I went and looked at the different objects that might help me to understand Ohm's work and his life and how it had been interpreted. So I visited his home, that's the top left. I visited his gravestone. I found statues to him. So the one at the top is outside the Technical University in Munich. He sat looking very stately on a chair, and there are some books underneath the chair, so he looks like a scholar. The one underneath him is in Cologne, on Cologne Town Hall, and he's holding one of his bits of apparatus. So that speaks much more to him being an experimenter and working with instruments. And then some of his objects, that's the bottom left, are in the Deutsches Museum collection as well. So we can start to piece together ways that the story of Ohm has been told, not just through texts, but also through material things. You could call it a material historiography. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll remember I said that the original instrument doesn't survive. Several people have been involved in recreating the instrument from his descriptions and his depictions. So just to briefly talk you through them then, the one on the top left is in the collections of the Science Museum, and that was made for the 1931 Faraday Centenary Exhibition, a great big celebration of Faraday's work, but also there were lots and lots of these instruments produced, reworked from historical experiment. And some of them were designed to be operated. This particular one wasn't. So it performs a kind of commemorative function. The top right is in the collection of the Deutsches Museum. It was made for the 1977 150th anniversary of Ohm's law. So again, it's commemorative, This one went on display, but before they put it on display, they did try and operate it. They got it made in such a way that it could be used. So it has a slightly different purpose again. It's not just to look the part, but it was designed so that it could be functional, although they didn't write up that experimental reworking of it. So that wasn't their main use of it. And then at the bottom, we've got an instrument that was produced for Oldenburg University, where they had a teaching program where trainee teachers who are going to go on to be science teachers in schools would work with reworkings of historical apparatus. So very much designed to be used, doesn't quite look the part, doesn't have the same visual similarities to the picture as some of the others. So again, you can start to pull out a material historiography. The motivations behind each of these were different and they tell a different type of historical story. Now, in doing my research, it was quite notable that the literature review and the material culture review didn't really interact. They didn't reference each other, even though they both contain examples of deep scholarship. You can't recreate and rework that type of experiment without engaging in depth with the material description, with what Owen was doing. So serious scholarship involved in both, but they don't speak to each other at all. So getting back to my research then, I also undertook to rework the experimental apparatus, and I was doing it with a different set of motivations. I was interested in what, as a historian, I could learn by doing it, rather than as a commemorative thing or as a thing to help train teachers. So our material historiography continues. And there were a whole bunch of things, even before I started to operate the instrument, that I gained from undertaking practice in this way, working with materials. I'm not going to try and talk you through all of them. I don't have time, but I'm going to select a handful and just explain a bit more about what they mean. So the first one, and I think the most important one for me, was the idea that instruments are a way of accessing what the person using or making the instrument was thinking about. It provides another set of insights into their thoughts and their cognitive processes. I'm going to do a real whistle-stop rundown of what I mean and how I came to that conclusion. It's going to be super top line. I apologize, but I think it's worth just having a quick rundown. So if we go back to the 1970s and Gregory Bateson, he was an anthropologist who did a thought experiment. And he said, consider a blind man with a stick. Where does the blind man's self begin? Is it at the tip of the stick where that thing he's holding is interfacing with the world that he's trying to access? Or is it at the handle of the stick where he's getting the sensory information through touch about the world? Or is it somewhere in between, maybe halfway up the stick? And this thought experiment has proved really fruitful for a whole load of people. And for my purposes, you can imagine that instead of it being a blind person with a stick, it's a scientist who's trying to access something around the world they can't get through their sense organs, and they're using a scientific instrument. So we've got people like archaeologist Lambros Malafouris, who says, well, we can see here that human cognition was never entirely just in the head. We can see traces of thinking and cognition in the technologies and the materials that we've used. Art historians have also made similar arguments. So Anne-Sophie Lehmann has said, we don't think that the entire artwork is made in someone's brain and then they just impose it onto passive matter. It doesn't go directly from one thing to the other, but rather the material that you're using, the medium that you're using, helps to shape the artwork. Maybe you get some paint drips and you incorporate them in somehow. Maybe the clay you're working has particular affordances, and so on. So the material shapes the way the artist is thinking and working. And then my final quote comes from Rachel Prentice. She's an ethnographer who studied surgery. And she again took Bateson's thought experiment and said, it's not only that about where the person's self ends, but it's also about how operating with that stick structures the way the person is thinking, structures their cognition, structures their embodiment. So the instruments and the tools that we use shape the way that we think and the conclusions that we can draw around the world, about the world. So we can argue that this instrument, or this is the one that I worked with, but Ohm's instrument shaped the way that he was thinking, and I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. Another benefit was what I've referred to as visual acuity or connoisseurship, the idea that by looking at objects, I got a better sense of what different parts of objects did and how they work. And that was really useful because it meant I could look at a really complicated diagram like this. I don't expect anyone watching to be able to tell what this is, but because I'd got that visual acuity or sense of what what these instruments were and how they operated, I could draw some similarities out and say, oh yeah, I can see that micrometer at the top is the same as the one in Ohm's apparatus. I can see some other similarities in the shape of the mercury cups. And I could see and make an argument that Ohm had likely been reading Ampere's paper and had been influenced by him. So we can build up a visual acuity or connoisseurship. It also led me to think about the types of commodities and practices and changing standards that are different between now and in Ohm's time. I think the most standout example is that there's quite a lot of copper in Ohm's instrument. It's a metal, it's an element, and yet it was different for Ohm than it is now. And that's because the means of producing elemental copper left it with little voids inside at the time that Ohm was working. And that increases the amount of electrical resistance, which when you're trying to rework an electrical experiment is really important. So it forced me to think about things in ways that I wouldn't necessarily have done if I wasn't materially engaged. And then the last one I'm going to talk about before I finish refers back to that idea I mentioned, that we can read how an experimenter is thinking through their instruments to some extent. Because understanding Ohm's instrument helped me to better understand some of his written language. You don't have to understand all of this, but I will do my best to explain. So in 1825, Ohm's concept, what he said he was doing in his experiment, he said he was measuring a loss of force. And then in 1826, when he published his now famous law, his language had changed to him talking about there being an exciting force. Just a couple of words. He doesn't explain why he's changed his language at all in his writing. So historians have been left trying to make sense of it. And historians just looking at texts have said things like, well, in 1825, he was using an old-fashioned electrostatic understanding of the world, and he was following Coulomb, who'd been working decades before. And then by 1826, he'd caught up with best practice. He'd caught up and he understood that there was this electrodynamic theory, and he was following people like Fourier and using Fourier's maths. So he was out of date. He got himself up to date. I think there's a different and slightly simpler explanation if you understand the instrument he was using. So in 1825, he was connecting it up to a voltaic battery. It's quite unstable, and the bit he was watching to make his reading was a little needle that moved around, and that's how he was judging what was going on. So in 1825, he connected it up. The needle oscillated around a little bit, but then once it was stable, it still gradually went back to its starting place. It lost force over a period of time, and it either lost force quickly or it lost force slowly. And so what he was measuring was the rate of loss of force, and he was using that to make his argument. In 1826, he connected up a thermocouple instead, a new piece of technology, which was much more stable. So then what happened was he connected it up and the needle stayed there. And the thing that he had to do to take a measurement, if I just go back to my instrument, this bit at the top, he would turn it around, and he had to turn it more or less to overcome that exciting force, depending on the qualities of the test wire he'd put in. So you can see that he's using language that describes what he was seeing as much as perhaps relating some more theoretical concerns. And he was actually quite shy about, quite reluctant to use theory, and tended to be very descriptive in his writing. So I think this speaks to that. I'm going to stop there because I think I'm at time, but just to give you a sense of some of the tools that we can use when we're working with material objects that can help us in our historical work to make sense of the history of science a little bit better. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. That is very fascinating, and I mean, like, it's a very curious object itself. I think that there's a lot of questions actually about the subject, but I think that there's so many good points coming from your presentation that I think that would be like quite very much like going to be interesting discussion in the Q&A afterwards. So I'm going to move on to, and thank you, Charlotte, and I'm going to move on to Rupert now. Rupert, thank you so much for being with us. So I'm going to introduce Rupert before he starts. Rupert Cole is Associate Curator of Chemistry at the Science Museum, working in collaboration with the Royal Society of Chemistry. He completed his PhD in 2017 on the topic of the common culture, promoting science at the Royal Institution in post-war Britain at UCL. He is the curator of scientific instruments at the Science Museum London, with responsibility for experimental and industrial chemistry, optics, microscopy, weighing, measuring, and science teaching. Rupert is broadly interested in the public and material cultures of science and technology from the 18th century to the present. His particular expertise is in the post-1945 period, with interest in the history of the scientific establishment and institutions, social movements, controversial and countercultural science, and science in the media. He also has special interest in historical and contemporary interactions between the chemical industry, the environment and popular culture, and contemporary collecting in science. At present, he is working on the topic of food sustainability, something that actually very relevant and what many artist collectives in Indonesia actually like grapple about, especially regarding about how we handle or how we see food in relation to like food prices and the future of food, which actually like the topic of what is Rupert is now working on. So I hand over to Rupert. Please share with us your project. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. Thank you for that introduction. I'll just quickly share my slide deck. Yeah, so I will be talking about the process of doing research for exhibition development, and specifically in relation to one I'm developing at the moment on the topic of future of food, as Farah mentioned. So one of the kind of first steps that informed my thinking on this topic was around audience research reports that where we've sort of researched this topic previously, either for exhibitions, galleries, sometimes for event series, or just one-off research where we're trying to understand a particular segment of our audience and how they think about a topic. So I've listed on the top right there a few reports that have gone into our thinking for the future of food. But the one which really influenced me was one we conducted in 2021 called Sustainable Food. And this looked at public attitudes across the UK, Brazil, and India towards the topic of food and sustainability. And one of the key findings from that report was, yes, from all the participants, and I think there was something like 2,000 participants in the survey, there was a very high interest in food issues and topics around food, but the greatest concern was when those food issues related to the environment, so topics like climate change and biodiversity loss. So from this finding, I really wanted to make sure the exhibition sat at that exchange, or that point where those two things interact. So with that in mind, I decided to focus on food production. So yeah, the topic of food and the future of food is a massive one. You could take loads of different angles. When the V&A did their food exhibition, that's the Victoria and Albert Museum, one of our neighbours in South Kensington in London, they decided to cover all aspects of the food system, from production through to processing and manufacturing, through to distribution, through to cooking and eating and waste. And while I think that show had many great assets and did the topic really well, even from our point of view, it was very much focused on design, whereas ours is science and technology. I kind of thought if we wanted to explore environmental sustainability, we needed to focus on the aspects of the food system where that has the most relevance. And yeah, as you see on the graph on the right, the food system, and this is slightly old now, the food system accounts for about 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's absolutely huge. And unlike some industries, it's one which has a lot of potential for decarbonisation. But when you look at that 30%, 80% of that is to do with food production. And furthermore, that is the area where science and technology can actually have a massive impact. So in terms of creating a kind of USP for the Science Museum, why we should focus on food as a topic, I thought food production really ticked that box. Furthermore, some other sort of principles I've developed around the exhibition and still developing is that we needed to cover this in a global way and not just focus on the UK. Sometimes for contemporary science and technology focused shows, we do have quite a national focus for lots of different reasons. But considering the food system is so globally interconnected, it really didn't make sense to just pick a single country. And yeah, the way the food system is structured, it's global as well. So for that reason, I'd say the exhibition had to be global in its scope, but also we wanted to make sure we were balancing stories from global north and global south and different regions where there's different climatic challenges and concerns. And finally, in presenting science and technology in terms of developments on the horizon, I wanted to make sure we were providing audiences with tools to critically engage and debate these new developments. So making sure we're not just presenting developments uncritically, perhaps as silver bullets, offering to solve all our problems. Whatever the development was, I wanted to make sure we were showing pros and cons and crucially encouraging debates rather than being sort of didactic. So when thinking about how we research exhibitions, and this one in particular, I've kind of broke it into different categories and different phases of research. So the first phase is very much big picture scoping. So what's the big idea? What is what's our focus, which I've just talked about, but how are we going to frame it? And yeah, I've been working on this exhibition for about 1.5 years, and we've recently moved exhibition space from one gallery to another. It's given us a lot more gallery space to work in, but also higher budget, different audience, different target audience, and also a different focus for the gallery in terms of the previous space is very much contemporary science and technology. So I've just been going back to an earlier phase of exhibition development where I'm now redoing the big picture. And in doing that, the kind of research methods I use are reading lots of secondary literature on the topic, and the future of food is a topic which is very much in the zeitgeist right now. As you can see from the left, it's just a small handful of the many books on this topic that have been published in the last few years. There's also a really broad historical literature on the topic of food and food sustainability. So I've been doing that at the moment and combining that with sort of speaking to experts. So a lot of our curators are generalists rather than specialists in the areas that they cover topics. And this is definitely the case for this exhibition. I didn't come with it with a large amount of expertise. So I very much rely on speaking to experts and creatives and other curators, as well as attending sort of events and talks. So the other phase is really quickly, once I've kind of developed that big picture, I want to then sort of hone and refine it and go into more detail about what the narrative is of the exhibition and how we're going to structure it for our visitors. So at the moment, I'm just moving into this phase again. And again, doing lots of secondary literature reviews and reading, but for this area, doing it more targeted on very specific topics. And also attending conferences, I think, and going out on research visits. This is kind of crucial for this stage. And finally, the bit after that, kind of concurrently as well, is to kind of research potential objects and what the stories behind those objects are, particularly trying to showcase people-driven narratives. So skipping on to that bit, we've done quite a lot of object research already. So as I mentioned, we were previously quite far in development when the show was in a previous space. So I have quite a lot of thinking and research already in this area. So The first kind of category is looking at museum collections, whether that's the Science Museum's collection or other museum collections. And here I've highlighted a few objects from the Science Museum we're hoping to feature in the show. So the far left one is a really, really early, perhaps the earliest example of a preserved food can. So this will be used to tell the story of food processing, which began with preservation in an industrial scale, as a way of talking about industrial foods and how the industrial food system has tended to try and argue that we should be cooking less and buying more processed food. And that's the topic we want to deal with in the exhibition. To do that topic, I kind of want to show the history of it. And this is very much my approach with using these collections, giving some historical and cultural context. And I would say, certainly with the Science Museum's collection, there's lots on the history of the food system, but not so much on contemporary issues. So objects relating to the last 20, 30 years. So very much the collections I'm drawing on are for historical narratives. Just to mention one other, which is a really important object and was part of my thinking from the very beginning, was Fritz Haber's sample of liquefied ammonia, which led to the first synthetic nitrogen fertilizer made by the Haber and Bosch process. And historians have considered this development perhaps the most important invention of the 20th century. It's completely changed agriculture. After the post-war period, it led to massive increased yields. But there's a dark side to this story, and it's one of the reasons I think it's such an important object to include. Synthetic fertilizer is one of the key reasons the food system has such high carbon emissions. It also is responsible for a lot of ecological pollution. And so in many ways, synthetic fertilizer is no longer sustainable, as scientists think. So we're kind of at this juncture of where do we go next to ensure our soils can stay fertile if we're moving away from a really energy intensive process to make chemical fertilizer. And very much it positions my approach to the exhibition of a turning point where we have different visions for the future of food to look towards, moving away from the current industrialized, chemically intensive method of producing food. Another avenue in which I've come across object ideas is going to conferences. So one key conference we went to earlier this year was the Oxford Real Farming Conference. And this is very much a kind of radical farming conference set up in opposition to the Oxford Farming Conference. So they add the word real in, and it features a lot of people involved in this new field. It's kind of a development from organic farming called agroecology, which is all about taking ecological approaches to farming. And within one of the sessions there, I came across a painting that we might display. And it was a really great find, actually, because agroecology is a kind of philosophic approach to farming, which is very difficult to try and represent through material culture. And it's one of those things I was considering, how are we going to do that? And so I went to a talk where they were discussing a series of dialogues they had around COP26. And as part of these dialogues, which connected farmers around the world, thinking about what does the future of food look like in terms of farming, an artist, a market gardener called Emily Tuff, she listened to these dialogues and produced this painting on the left, which she called the agroecology jigsaw, which represented the collective visions of these farmers in how they can move towards an agroecology-based future of food. And since then, they've produced actual jigsaws of this, which they've distributed around different community-based agroecology hubs around the UK. But also there was one of these jigsaws which was used at COP26 to try and educate politicians around this new movement. And finally, the other area I've been looking into is in terms of how I source my objects for the show, is around approaching companies and organizations. So particularly when you're doing contemporary collecting and focusing on sort of contemporary areas of the future of food, it's vital that we speak to companies who are on these developments. So one area we want to feature is on lab cultured meat. That's producing meat from stem cells, opposed to producing meat from grown livestock. And this is a very big emerging industry around what some people have described as a kind of technological fix. And a lot of it's funded by Silicon Valley. So one company we've spoken to produced the first beef steak in a sort of laboratory environment, which they're in the process of scaling up. And so we have they donated to us the very first sample of that steak that they produced outside of a cow. And so that's potentially an object we might display, but working with them is much trickier than working with museums or research organizations, because companies tend to be very conscious of the message which they're putting out, and often want some kind of editorial input into the way you're framing their objects. And yeah, finally, I'll just quickly mention some objects around a research institute based in Kenya called Sesi, who developed this really transformative ecological approach to controlling pests in Africa. And this was research where they analyze plant hormones in order to try and develop deterrents for insect pests. And it's been wildly successful. It's developed in the 90s and has now been adopted by 500,000 African subsistence farmers, completely changing the life of many farmers who were losing up to 80–90% of their yields. And part of this success was down to the dissemination of this technology, this ecological technology. And one of the ways they disseminate it was through a radio drama series, which was described to me as a Kenyan version of The Archers, so a kind of agricultural drama where they put into the storylines this new technology. And we've been offered a radio used and owned by a farmer, on the right, the one pictured, the actual one. So when I talked about people stories earlier, that's a really key one where we know the object was actually the one used by a farmer. And yeah, just to conclude, I've primarily been talking about curatorial research today, but I really want to emphasize that the way we produce exhibitions at the Science Museum is an extremely collaborative process, drawing on lots of expertise from different departments and colleagues. And within each of those expertise, there is, I guess, research associated with them. So I mentioned audience research. We're lucky at the Science Museum to have a dedicated audience research department, and they continue working with us through the exhibition, producing kind of formative and summative research through that process to inform how we curate the show and develop the show. I've been talking about curatorial, but the other side of the coin is if we are researching and finding out what stories we should tell, our interpretation department are looking at how we should tell those stories and do lots of research on how other museums tell stories around similar subjects. So yeah, that's another approach. And similar to that, our learning team do lots of research-based activities around collaborative and community-based exhibition production, which we will definitely be drawing on for this show. And finally, colleagues in conservation often have to do research based on the objects we want to show, whether there's challenges in the way we want to display them. So if we want to have working objects, or how we can make sure something won't degrade if we want to put it on display, or issues around health and safety, if they're, for example, putting on some nasty chemical pesticides on display, how we can manage that. So I think I will stop there, but thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Rupert. But maybe just kind of like one quick question for me, or something that to share with the audience, is that when is the Future of Food exhibition will be held again?
Sorry, I should have said it's opening in summer 2025.
Oh, okay, still a long way. Okay, good luck.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, thanks so much, Rupert. And we move on to Alice now. Alice Naylor. So a bit about Alice is The Alice Naylor is an Art and Humanities Research Council founded collaborative doctoral student with the University of Portsmouth with the Science Museum Group. She is now in the third year of her PhD. I Appeal is by Appeal, the design, mediation, and consumption of Kenwood kitchen appliances from 1947 to 1985. Alice has a background in product design and completed her MA in the history of design at the Royal College of Arts and the PNA in 2020. So as I discussed with Alice before, actually like Kenwood, we're in Indonesia actually quite familiar with Kenwood products, so it will be quite exciting to see what she's now working on with her research. Please, Alice.
Thank you for your introduction, and I'm going to share my screen. I hope with it's going to work. Can you see the screen?
Not yet now. Maybe
okay. Let me just. Oh, right. I'm going to go back. Sorry. This is the bit I always slightly get wrong. Here we go. Right.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Good. You can now shoot my screen. Fantastic. Yes. Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
Great.
So I'm here to talk about how I've made use of the Science Museum archives to run 2 live action events that have enabled me to explore a new area of research regarding the selling strategies of the Kenwood Manufacturing Company. So I'm going to give you some background about the Kenwood Manufacturing Company. It was co-founded by Kenneth Wood and Roger Lawrence in 1947, and it's a historic British brand and whose kitchen appliances are well regarded, not just by design aficionados for their eye-catching appearance and product innovation, but by consumers who value their performance, desirability, and longevity. So the Science Museum holdings contain a collection of papers, chiefly publicity and some business sort of papers of the dealings of Kenneth Wood from 1947 to 1968. So Kenwood is now owned by the Italian company DeLonghi, and they also hold an informal archive, which I've accessed, but it is not ordered or categorized in any way. So the museum's holdings are the most extensive official source of the company's business and publicity records. So this is the first time that Kenwood material held by the museum has been used in an academic context. So no PhD, book or article has covered an in-depth study of Kenwood's singular impact on consumer durables, utilising the museum's archives. And this is the first project using such material as a source. So I'm taking an interdisciplinary approach to my research, and alongside the holdings here, I'm drawing on material culture practices and object analysis of Kenwood chefs, and 2 have been donated to the project by members of the public, and additional archive material from other organisations and Kenwood's own archives and oral history records. So the museum's archives and comparable objects in their collections enable me to interrogate Kenwood appliances in the context of new technology. Was it actually innovative, or was it about colour and form and newness? And what part did price play in the desirability? How are technology and aesthetics intertwined in developing a new kind of food mixer for post-war consumers hungry for the fresh and the innovative? So the outcomes of my research will not only result in my thesis, but will benefit the museum by offering the public an alternative way of making connections with objects in the collections. And using the Kenwood chef as a focal point, it offers playful and informative ways for the public to connect with the histories of domestic technologies, that is, new ideas around the social history of domestic appliances, in particular those with connections to the home and ties to the kitchen. And they've been used by historians of technology and design and commentators on feminist history and economics as a means of understanding the gender division of labour, consumer aspirations, and the multiple strands of modern life. So the primary object on which my attention is focused is the Kenwood chef. And these are 2 examples that the museum has in their collections, not on display, interestingly enough. The A700 is, but the A701 is not. But it has a particular identity in British consumer culture. It's valued highly by consumers as a technically excellent food mixer, and it's a stylish addition for the modern kitchen. And its innovative functionality and longevity are additional reasons for its appeal for historians of design, technology, and social history. And the use of material culture and examining the lived experience is relevant here because it helps me to understand that objects have social lives and reveals the meanings that people attribute to things. And so why the chef looked the way it did, why its shape and materiality changed and how it was mediated to consumers are important considerations for me to understand its impact on the market and how it fed into the appetite for consumer durables in post-war Britain. So it was launched in 1950, and it was not the only food mixer on the market, and Kenwood was not the only company to manufacture mixers in the decades that followed, but their legacy has continued despite rival companies offering similar kitchen appliances and compelling marketing strategies. So in the history of consumer durables inside the home, food mixers are significantly under-researched, with refrigerators, washing machines, and vacuum cleaners forming the main hierarchy of appliances known as white goods. These have been paid attention by historians of social history, technology, and design, but a comprehensive historiography of the food mixer and its exclusion in the wider context of the consumer durable market is a bit of a puzzle for me. So my research gives me the opportunity to contribute new and original research to the history of the food mixer, how it was sold to consumers, and an enhanced and reconfigured inclusion in the history of domestic technologies in post-war British homes. So I want to start with my selling from the experts. So the Kenwood chef was at the forefront of food mixers introduced to post-war Britain. And part of my conjecture on the impact in the market is that aside from its good looks and technical excellence, the way it was sold has contributed to its hold on the market and the minds of consumers. And a key thread of my research seeks to define and clarify the company's singular method of performative selling and identify whether these mediation strategies contributed to its global success and its position in British product design history. And I'm seeking to understand the significance of demonstrations as visual and tactile selling strategies and the roles these performative mediation techniques have played in laying out the values, excellence, and aspirational nature of the Kenwood food mixer. So Kenwood deployed trained almost always female demonstrators to explain and promote and sell the company's appliances in sites of consumption such as department stores and electricity showrooms. And you have on the left, you have Margaret Patton, who was a very well-renowned home economist, and she's demonstrating it in Harrods, where it was first sold in 1950. And the other one I find quite interesting because, of course, there always is a man in the suit. He's kind of semi-mansplaining without saying anything to the woman. But these demonstrations happened, very, very frequently around Kenwood appliances from the 1950s onwards. The raison d'etre of a traditional theatre performance, as we understand it, is to alert audiences to new ideas and visions and sounds and pleasures. And the demonstrators tamed by Kenwood to bring the chefs to life in these stage settings of retail outlets were really important. The demonstrators were semi-scripted, and a key asset for the role of the demonstrator was, and I quote, enthusiasm and complete confidence. And one former demonstrator stated that, after all, it is a form of acting, whether one tries to put over a story to an audience in the theatre or in a commercial stall. So we have demonstrations as staged performances, and Kenneth Wood brought all these women together. He handpicked these ladies, not entirely sure. I mean, I think mostly they were older women who had the authority, very often married, they were housewives, they understood how things operated. I see this stage, professional theatre and a department store, which sharing a similar immersive landscape with trained performers and props and a captive audience. And demonstrators, and I mean Kenwood demonstrators, were very popular. And these were advertised in local newspapers. I mean, what I love about this particular cartoon here, which is from the Kenwood Holdings, and if you can't read it, it says she puts it over well, never stops for a laugh when it says take 2 eggs. Now, this is a sort of double-edged sword. They're laughing about her performance, and it's a nod to the fact that in this time, food was still rationed, so eggs were probably quite hard to get hold of. And the women on the right, I mean, I love their aprons, their shirts. You know, they look like women who know what they are doing, and that was the point of these demonstrations. And so tickets were sold for demonstrations, and they sold out, and for performances across the country, and it involved singers and comedy routines. And in some cases, they were funded by organisations such as the Bacon Information Council and manufacturers of electric appliances. And it was the case that the performative nature played a part in their popularity, along with the sight of individuals introducing audiences to aspirational consumer durables. And these events sort of appear to be like a hybrid information by way of entertainment. And I think were a playful and engaging way of proposing ideas of modernity by the way of labour-saving devices for the home. So we understand how archives can shape and define research, and the museum's holding contain a script composed by Kenwood for their demonstrator teams in 1948. And it lays out the exact details of how a demonstrator should operate the machine in front of her audience in the manner of theatre, where a semi-scripted, semi-choreographed performance was played out to eager audiences. I mean, this one is a 2-page script. There's a little clip here, which I love the idea of. In fact, they're talking about the spray and the eddy. I mean, it's all very visual, very kind of exciting. And so the materiality of the chef is central to its appeal, and demonstrators were trained to harmonize their movements alongside that of the machine. So it was the click of the on switch and the hum of the motor. And it was a satisfying whir when the machine was activated, and it was integral to bringing it to life. So there are practical difficulties in attempting to reconstruct the lives and careers of Kenwood demonstrators. The timeline of women working in retail outlets dates from the launch of the Kenwood Chef in 1950, but this script's a great example of how archives can be used as inspiration for new areas of research. So my aims for the event that I ran, my Kenwood script was a template for reenacting demonstrator performances, and it formed the basis of these 2 live events that took place at the Spring Arts and Heritage Centre in Havant, where the Kenwood factory is based, in November 22. And we were really keen to engage with audiences who had an intergenerational connections to Kenwood. The company's got a history of employing families in the area across all parts of the business, from production line to office and managerial staff. And it opens up connections to social and public history for the community, who have the opportunity to see the stories of their working lives reflected upon and how they're valued and historicised. So the lead actor of our show was the vintage Kenwood chef. And this was designed by Sir Kenneth Grange in 1960, and it's an elegant and fashionable food mixer, and it was one of the kitchen appliances that defined the Kenwood Chef brand throughout the 1960s and 1970s. So in collaboration with Dr. Helen Hebbert at the museum, the curator of consumer and environmental technology, and an ex-Kenwood demonstrator, Pauline Bateman, and students from the University of Portsmouth, you can see one in the middle here, we devised our version of a Kenwood selling demonstration. And the reasons for this were twofold. I saw it as an opportunity to undertake action research to further understand selling Kenwood appliances as a theatrical performance. And in addition, I was keen to bring elements of my research to non-academic audiences and extend the museum's remit for public engagement outside the traditional museum space. And I was confident that reenacting demonstrations using the aforementioned archival material, ethnographic fieldwork and object analysis, combined with oral history testimonies, would reveal the lived experiences of demonstrators and audiences in a stage selling setup. It was a 2-part event. It developed in the theatre space at the Spring, and the workshop was attended by members of the public, including this woman here who was so excited to see us show the Kenwood in front of her. It was incredible to get their testimonies, which I've added to my research. And they offered their ideas and their stories, and we developed our own version of a scripted performance. And these were reenacted at a separate event in the Springs Vintage Kitchen, and you can see here, which ran for about 15 minutes and which was the average length of the Kenwood demonstration. So the site of this event was key to drawing on the social geography of the company. The Kenwood factory has been located here since 1962, and its arrival offered excellent job opportunities for the local community and continues to be a key employer in the area. So they were located in the kitchen where the Kenwood chef was at the forefront, and they were fully immersed themselves and their audiences in the spectacle of theatrical selling with some balletic movements and their own personal script. They communicated the general excellence of the chef, and it was an essential appliance for every home, and they made it click and they whir and hum, and it was so successful that I think that if we had it for sale, people would have snapped it up. And audience participation was integral to the shows, and the interactions between demonstrators and spectators and the chef made a powerful case for the effectiveness of selling as a performance. And they gathered significant publicity in local print and broadcast media, and audience members attended with photographs and publicity leaflets. And in one case, somebody bought an apron that they'd used in the company training school. So I'm leading up to how I'm exploring my thinking, and I'm getting towards the end of my presentation. I mean, action research situated as doing and of opening up and activating the ways in which individuals connect with objects has been a revealing part of my research. The events substantiated my hypotheses that action research and ethnographic fieldwork is a highly effective and unique way in which to substantiate that Kenwood's hold on the market was due in part to product demonstrations. It's enabled me to interrogate the potency of Kenwood's interactive selling strategies and the opportunities to reflect on the meanings, attachments, and value placed on kitchen appliances and the emotional resonances that they evoke. The premise that reenacting demonstrator events using archival objects and oral history testimonies would uncover the company's singular selling strategies, and it consolidated my view that selling as a performance was a powerful way of engaging all post-war consumers with new ideas and innovations linked to the home. It's got expressions of pride in the ownership, and the clubbable element of possessing a high cost and fashionable item confirm my belief that presenting the values, excellent and aspirational nature of the Kenwood chef via the means of product demonstrations allows us to understand how a kitchen appliance can be ascribed multiple meanings. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alice, for a very interesting presentation. I will now open the Q&A box for anyone here who would like to, ask questions or maybe some comments. Please do. We have the Q&A box, and I will try to moderate. But I think that first of all, I thank you so much for all the three speakers. We've gone through like very, very fascinating. Kind of a bit like similar but different approaches of exhibiting science, or research and exhibiting science, especially from the Science Museum Group projects. And we have like material-led approach in exhibiting scientific instruments and its text by Charlotte, and also like the process of research and curatorial in the plan of the Future of Food exhibition, tackling global issues. Like specifically about the future of food, and also Alice presented about how domestic technology such as Kenwood kitchen appliances and its history as reflecting an ancient society. And I thank you so much. I would like to actually I do have probably like two questions for all the speakers actually. I think that either one of you can actually like comment or maybe respond like some 2 points that like my takeaway from the presentation was that I think like some of the quite silly question actually like from me, and especially some response or feedback that I get when I distributed information about the session was that does one have to be a scientist to curate or to research on science, or on how do you exhibit, how do you work on science as a subject in museums? And I think that is quite clear, I think that is touched upon as well, like especially like in Rupert's and Charlotte's presentation, that one does not have to be, does not necessarily have to have a scientific background in order to exhibit scientific objects or scientific topics, issues in museums. But I think that I do have a question. Like, one is that how do you allow artistic? Maybe this is probably more for Charlotte and also for Rupert as curators. How do you allow artistic license in the exhibitions, or do you allow artistic license to develop some artistic license, or to what length do you allow it in your exhibition? Like, for example, like in Science Museum, for example, I do notice there are, like, let's say, artist commissions in the gallery, for example, in the Madison Gallery. So that is actually like my question regarding about the curative scientific-based exhibition. And another point that I took from all the three speakers is that there's a strong connection, or somehow there's kind of like a tiptoeing between science and exhibiting science, or science as a subject matter in a museum, and also actually it's about industry. And like, for example, like from what I get from Rupert, and how we deal with food, or the food situation globally, that it also deals with the food industry, and whether the exhibition or the research itself meant to be also kind of like how to reflect on industry, or in particular probably like the market itself. Maybe that's somehow, I hope I make myself clear, and I don't know, maybe Charlotte can respond to my question, or afterwards. Yeah.
Shall I jump in first, Rupert? So yeah, your question about do we allow artistic license in exhibitions? I think so. It's very rare, possibly it never happens, that we're doing an exhibition with the purpose of teaching somebody scientific facts in the way that you might if they were in school. We're not going to expect people to be able to pass an exam at the end. But we have different things that we are trying to do in different exhibitions. So some of them might be thinking about inspiring people to consider science as a career in their future, and showing the kinds of impacts that they might have if they undertake scientific work. Others might be to investigate the beauty of science. So we did an exhibition about science and art at the Science Museum a few years ago. There's one about science fiction at the moment. Other times it might be about culture of science. Who gets to do science? Historically privileged people, privileged men often have got to do science, and maybe women or people who didn't have the same level of privilege weren't able to. And we might be investigating those kinds of cultural stories. So, I think there's artistry and creativity in everything we do, and we're always thinking about who is our audience and what are the things that we want them to find out about when they experience our exhibitions. And so that helps us to decide where we take those liberties and in what direction we take them. And you referred to artist commissions, and often they are responding to our content, but they're not supposed to be delivering scientific fact. It's supposed to be an artist's response to particular issues at play. So if it's an exhibition about food, I mean, we all eat, we all experience food. An artist is just as able to respond to that as someone with scientific knowledge, but they'll have a different perspective. Or medicine, we all have medical needs at various points in our lives. Artists just as well as scientists. So I think, there are so many different ways of exploring science and technology, and it's part of all of our lives, and it's so multifaceted that art has lots of different ways that it can help us to respond to those. Shall I stop there, or do you want me to respond to your other question as well? Maybe if I stop there, that makes more sense.
Okay, maybe we can go to Rupert first about the artistic license question. Please, Rupert.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, my Wi-Fi connection is a bit dodgy, so it was cutting out a little bit there. But yeah, on the question, just to add to Charlotte's comments on artist commissions and working with artists in an exhibition context. I think it's really vital, actually, and I think we're quite keen not to just present one voice, whether that's kind of the voice of scientists or technologists or industrialists, and particularly around controversial areas of science and technology, which can have both positive and negative impacts on people's everyday lives. I think it's really important to bring in artistic and, or not just artistic voices, but other voices beyond those directly involved in the development. So, for example, for cultured meat, which I discussed briefly, that's quite a contentious issue. Very much speaks to that issue of where's science and technology taking us? Do we want a future where our meat's all produced in these kind of giant factories and perhaps controlled by a small amount of big multinationals? So there's lots of kind of ethical questions which are completely embedded in the technological development, particularly around intellectual property. And there's amazing, artistic responses to this development specifically, which we want to try and feature. And the kind of cultural aspect around it as well. How will, for example, there's some brilliant research going at Oxford for how Muslim communities will receive particular kinds of cultured meat. Will that be sort of adopted into their kind of cultural culture of food? On the question you asked as well about whether it's necessary to have a scientific background to curate science exhibitions, I'm strongly of the opinion that it's not. I mean, speaking personally, I don't have a scientific background, and I think, well, it can be helpful with some areas of content if you have that kind of head start, particularly on contemporary issues. The nature of kind of studying science at undergraduate or postgraduate level is quite specialized, and because of the way we do exhibitions and the way our collections are, that in terms of managing them, they're on incredibly broad topics. So I don't think you could really ever be a sort of a master of an entire subject anyway. And I think there's advantages of both. Advantages of having a non-scientific background. You might be sort of more in tune to how to translate technical information, for instance, if you have to kind of go through that process of understanding it yourself. But yeah, I'll stop talking now and pass the baton on.
I mean, I just want to agree with Rupert, and probably to a certain extent. I mean, I haven't got a scientific background. I've got a polymathic background with lots of different disciplines. But I think the way you can bring things to life, for a lay audience, that's certainly something I'm really interested in, which is why these events that I ran last year were so. I mean, it taught me the way that people connect with things outside of the scientific community, but how it's really, really relevant. And I thought, if there is a way that I can do these, I would love to do these events to a wider audience, even more staged than they were before, because I do think it's a really interesting way for people to connect with technology, as I keep calling it domestic technology, but it is, I think, sometimes kind of reduced to smaller than it really is. It's actually much bigger, I think, because it's gendered and very much it's associated with women. So exploring women's histories and histories in the home via this medium, I think is really important, and certainly something my research has revealed to me. I'm really so surprised that that the victory is the sort of the vacuum cleaner, the refrigerator and washing machine in this hierarchy that I've described, and yet the food mixer has just seemed to have escaped any kind of in-depth scrutiny. So it's a really great opportunity, I think, to bring it to the forefront and explore these feelings and these constellations of things that I used in the Benheim-Moore quote, which is really relevant. So it's a wonderful opportunity to bring these things to a wider audience.
Thank you, Alice. And yes, I mean, I think that so far there's no open questions. It might be probably just coming from me for now. And actually, that's the thing. Like when people heard about science, or science museum, it's kind of, oh my God, it's science. I mean, do I need to be a scientist, or do I actually have to understand science first? But thank you so much, everyone, for confirming that we don't need to have scientific background in order to tell a story about our really. I think that I borrow from Alice is like our connections to things, our connections to industrial or consumer or technological products that have been around us, and actually each has its own history. And that's like what Alice's point is that you can actually see how these speaks about, let's say, gender issues or gender history as well in our society. Thanks so much. And I think like before we, I think that we don't really have much time left anyway. But I think like moving on a bit about my question on, like this. It's kind of like a blurred line between dealing with scientific objects and also industrial project, and between science and industry. Maybe I don't know. Maybe Alice, while you're at it, you can probably have a comment on that. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, what you're asking me to kind of extrapolate.
Industry as in market related, like
market related. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is really. I mean, I think it's really interesting thinking of this idea of the industrialized object, because again we go back to the kind of industry of the home, even though when the initial very early models of Kenwood were actually designed for sort of hotels. I mean, they're great big sort of beasts of burden, which I find really interesting. But I love the idea of these things being kind of shrunk down, and to a certain, I mean, there's an idea that I find really intriguing about this sort of the taxonomy of how objects are kind of industrial objects. So I'm looking at I've made a lot of connections with the way that a car is mediated to consumers and sort of in industry and the food mixer. And there are many more similarities than one would think, but it's kind of been excluded from this conversation, again, because we're looking at through, for a lot of people, through the feminine, the feminine lens. And so I'm trying, one of my lines of research and exploration is to kind of expand these discourses here. And I suppose, industry seems to be so often about the wider kind of noisiness and sort of masculine idea of it. And this is a different kind of industry. So it's just reframing the argument, I think, is intriguing, and certainly how the museum can do that. I mean, if you look at the displays in the Making a Modern World, it strikes me as quite interesting that so much of the stuff for the home is stuck behind cases, and the big stuff is hung above your head, like the aeroplanes and the cars and stuff. And it'd be great to see it reverse the other way around and have giant food mixers hanging from the ceiling and sewing machines.
We'd love to see that. We'd love to see that.
At the forefront of industry that was really important, and it has enabled people to make their living, particularly women, for quite a few centuries. So yeah, that would be a nice turn. I'm not quite sure the curators would like it very much.
Thank you so much. We'd love to see that, Alice, aside from probably like more masculine, like the spaceship or space shuttle or something like that. I would say, yeah, maybe Rupert or Charlotte, you have comment on, like the information science and industry?
Sure, happy to comment. Yeah, I think I cut out on your original description for the question. It's just, are you asking about the kind of interrelations between science and industry?
Yes.
Yeah. So I kind of think
and
one
how
of the key.
that translate, yeah. Sorry, please continue.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the kind of key things to think about in this context is scale, and scaling up. It's an area which historians of science actually have recently become interested in as a kind of concept that applies particularly to science and technology. And I think when you're looking at sort of cutting edge scientific developments, and in the Future of Food exhibition, we might be showcasing stuff which are very much at the laboratory scale and very much at the kind of research and development phase, where they might take 30, 40, 50 years to scale up to industrial processes. And I think it's when you start looking at this scale and that scaling up process, you then get into interesting questions around sustainability and energy use. So yeah, to keep going back to the same example, but with cultured meat, I think that's one of the key questions they have as an industry right now. The scientific process, I guess, and the technology is there. So there isn't a huge amount more to do with the basic producing meat from stem cells and grow them in a cultured medium. But the real question is, can they do this in a kind of 1,000-litre bioreactor in a way that makes cultured meat affordable and also doesn't require huge amounts of energy to produce it, where it actually becomes less less sustainable than traditional livestock farming, particularly when that farming is done in an environmentally conscious way. So I think thinking around questions of scale is really important when you're talking about sustainability and that interplay between scientific development and industrial processes.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Rupert. Charlotte, do you have any comment on the topic or some response?
Excuse me. Yeah, I suppose while I was listening to both Alice and Rupert speaking, I was thinking about the particular collections we have at the Science and Media Museum in Bradford, and thinking about the extent to which our lives have been impacted on by industrialization. And we do tend to think about the big things, but then I was just reflecting on the kinds of things I've got around my person, like my mobile phone or the laptop, and how these products of industry are kind of, they've proliferated to be worn about my person and my watch. And yeah, I think it's that scale thing, isn't it, that Rupert's talking about. We struggle a little bit to recognize that this tiny thing on my wrist is the product of a massive industrial process that involves not only factories mass producing stuff, but digging up mineral resources in various places around the world and transporting. And, you know, we're reliant on those massive infrastructure networks as well. So it is all incredibly interrelated. And yeah, just I don't know where I'm going with this, but yeah, there's definitely something in there about not only understanding the scientific processes behind how the technology we use works, but also the industrial processes that are necessary to bring them, to deliver them to our homes and workplaces or wherever we are. Yeah, just knowing the science isn't enough, I guess is what I mean. You need all of that infrastructure to end up with our contemporary way of living.
Thank you all. Thanks so much, Charlotte, Rupert, and Alice. Actually, we already kind of near our end of the session, and still no open questions. But I'm having a really great Q&A. I mean, like talk with you guys. Again, it's been a privilege. It's actually like I hope. I mean, I've been kind of like really inspired by all your sharing, and I hope this should be like a great takeaway to everyone joining. We have like some museum and also like art collective from Indonesia, some of them who's going to be joining us again in the creative lab that we are organizing with Stefania, like end of March. But okay, so as we reach the end of our introductory session, again, hope you're not bored, I would like to thank Charlotte, Rupert, and Alice for all their fascinating presentation. I would like to announce and invite you all to join us again tomorrow, Tuesday, 21st of March. It's about Indonesia and Southeast Asia collections in museums, in UK and Indonesian museums, with Nick Barnard from Victoria and Albert Museum, Sadia Boonstra from Museum and Cagar Budaya, Alexander Green from the British Museum, and Adrian Plow with Yoshika Kobayashi from Wellcome Trust Collections, chaired by Melinda Susanto from Leiden University. And hope to see you tomorrow. And thank you so much again, everyone. And yeah, see you again soon. Terima kasih. Thanks all.